There we go. Hello, wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we're on episode 79, Basic Web Components and Practices. I'm your host today, Justin Ribeiro, and with me on the panel we have Leon Reville.
Hiya from England.
And our guest today, speaking about basic web components, see, I told you I'd screw it up, Jan.
No worries.
We have Jan and Raphael. Hi, guys. How's it going today?
Hi. Doing very well. Thank you.
So, introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about yourselves for those wonderful people out there who don't know who you guys, sort of the things you guys are doing today.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. I'm Jan Mixins. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Component Kitchen, a startup that's focused on web components. We do consulting as well as lead the open source basic web components project that we'll be talking about today. And my sort of background is in user experience design, and that led to an interest in components and as a way of building better user experiences.
Okay, I am Raphaël Rougeron. I work for a small software company in France. I am the lead developer and Scrum Master of the team. And I focus mainly these days on front-end development. I do a lot of React and, of course, web components.
Cool. I'm Leon Reville. I've been working in the web space for roughly around 8 years now. But the last kind of 6 months to a year, I've really been getting excited about web components and playing around with seeing how far you can go building web apps and mobile applications just with web components without any frameworks. So that's kind of why I'm here at the minute.
Web components are a wonderful thing. I think here on the podcast we've talked about web components quite a bit over the last year, and things are consistently moving these days, where for so long sort of web components, it took a little while rather to get the spec up to par so that we get our standards so that we can build these wonderful things. Jan, tell us a little bit about the basic web components project. I mean, how did it come about? What made you decide one day, web components, this is the thing?
Yeah, so my interest in componentry goes back about 10 years. I was at my first startup. We were creating a website for families to manage their family calendar, and it was the first time I was moving away from downloaded Mac and Windows apps to the web. This would have been about 2004 when we got started, and I was struck repeatedly by the difficulty in doing some really simple basic things. So I'd be working with the development team, we'd plan out a design, and it would call for something pretty simple like a date picker. So if you're building a calendar app, that's a pretty obvious piece that you're going to need, and would be told, oh well, the web platform, such as it exists, doesn't have that. We've got divs and anchor tags and buttons. We could build a date picker from those pieces, but that'll be 3 to 5 weeks, something like that. And that was kind of a eye-opening experience to realize how hard it was to get even simple things done in a web application. And I think that people have gotten used to that, but I think we forget sort of the cost that we pay when we have to build everything from scratch ourselves. So it obviously takes a lot of time. It also skews our design choices. So we're going to opt for things that we can build rather than maybe the things we want to build, and it also prevents people from taking advantage of work that other people have done. So if someone's made a great date picker or menu or dialogue, whatever it is, they can't easily take advantage of it. And back in that day, jQuery sort of made it possible to do you could create a widget that would do something, but it wasn't standard, and it was hard to sort of wrangle a new widget into your app. So we fell into this pattern where when we were putting something new in our application, we would sort of search around on the web. We'd find, if we're looking for a date picker, we might find 5 date pickers, and then take the one that was the least bad, and then spend a week kind of wrangling it into our application so that it did what we wanted. And we figured there had to be a better way, and I began working on a sort of an architecture for a component model built on top of jQuery, and did that as an open source project for a number of years, and eventually in the course of that work came across Dmitry Glazgov's work on the initial web component specs at Google. This would have been about 2012, and was just knew that was going to be finally a standard for interoperable user interface elements on the web, and was quite excited about that. So transitioned all of the work that I was doing to that, and then 2 years ago got excited enough to found Component Kitchen based on the idea that this technology was going to be fairly transformative. As far as basic web components go, we saw that there's a lot of benefit that people can bring to their projects by using any component model. It just gives you a way, whether it's React components or basic web components, any sort of reasonably interesting framework will give you a way of componentizing your user interface, and that just gives you it's really about factoring your front end along the separation of concerns so that you can reason about your code base, you can have different people collaborating. That you get all that with web components as you would with any other component model. But for us, the sort of real advantage of web components is that by having a standard, you can afford for the first time to lavish attention on the details of really basic general purpose components that otherwise don't get the attention that we think they deserve. So, when someone's building, just yesterday I was trying to use a website and they had a pop-up element, and I click a button and a div pops over the rest of the page, and I decided I didn't want that pop-up, and I clicked outside of it to dismiss it. And the pop-up didn't go away, and so I hit the escape key to cancel it. No, that didn't work either, because the developer, maybe it could be a number of things. Maybe they're just in a rush, and they don't have time to implement these details, or maybe they're just unaware of them. They don't realize, hey, the keyboard's really important, or they just figure, well, how hard could it be? They say, I'm going to go make a menu, without realizing the enormous complexity that is masked by what appears to be a simple design. And so with basic web components, we said, if we are going to be able to create user interface elements that we can share and get, build some critical mass behind as an open source project, we would be able to afford the time to get these details right, so that we can go build a pop-up element that knows how to dismiss itself if you click outside of it, knows that you can cancel it, respects all the right accessibility APIs, and so on, so that we've created something that's very simple, very robust, can be used in a wide range of situations, and the people that want to use it don't even have to appreciate all that detail. All they know is, hey, I wanted a pop-up element, and I can either spend a few minutes adding a dependency to my app on a open source one in the basic web components project, or I can go write one from scratch. And even if they're going to do a hack job of it, they're going to still spend a day on it. So if it becomes more efficient for them to use a good one, then that's goodness all around. It means that the users of those apps will be able to use a highly usable pop-up element, maybe without the developer who picked that element, not even realizing all the subtlety to it. So that was sort of the initial motivation, was to say we should build a project that does a great job at these small, basic building blocks that let people build great, highly usable apps.
And details are key, right? I mean, a lot of times developers, like you say, don't have time. The details sort of get lost within certain types of specifications or requirements that people have to deal with. And having a solid base seems like an incredibly strong start point for many people. It sort of broadens the amount of developers who might be able to use such a component.
Yeah, we did an analysis a while back. We looked at a couple projects that we'd worked on, and we were trying to estimate the amount of front-end code that was dedicated to reproducing user interface patterns that had already been implemented elsewhere that were in fact quite common. So if you went through your code base and you said how much of my code is devoted to menus, dialogues, whatever, or pull to refresh, or swipe effects, if you tried to assess how much of my app is not unique, but just is shared. I'm just trying to do something that's been done 1,000 times before in other applications. Our best estimate is that about half your front-end code is probably trying to do those basics. And that's aside from the usability issues and people doing that and getting it wrong, it's just a tremendous waste of time. I mean, you could be twice as productive maybe if you were building with better building blocks.
What are some of the actual design goals around the Basic Web Components project?
So, as I mentioned, usability and design excellence are really sort of a paramount thing for us. So getting every one of those details right matters a lot to us. Details have this aspect in design that if you're doing a really good job, people don't notice them. We are okay with that. We want to make really great things with a lot of polish that people don't even notice. So that in that sense it should be. They should be focused on the experience of the app. So that's another goal, is that we care a lot about making the app developer look good. That they should be able to create something great, and they'll get all the attention. We don't have big egos. We're happy to let that happen.
What about customizability as well then? Because obviously you gave the pop-up example where you couldn't close the pop-up by escaping or something like that. Of course, in some situations, unfortunately, a customer might want to not allow the user to close that particular pop-up, etc. So obviously, is that something you're thinking about in this project as well?
Yeah, there's a wide range of expectations people have. I think a good example is something like a carousel. So there are lots of you can search for carousels, sort of implementations on the web, and there's a million of them, and every one of them will have sort of an expectation about what that experience is like. So you're going to have dots along the bottom of the carousel, or you're going to have arrows at the left and right side. We recognize that you can't get everything right, so we've tried to break things down into pieces that can be assembled into components. So that people can leave out the bits that they don't want, or they can change the attributes that they want to tune for their own application. We also try and measure up to a standard called the gold standard for web components, which is just a way of expressing the quality that a component should have in regards to its flexibility and customizability. So one thing we've seen is that a lot of people will create components that meet their needs, and then they publish that, whether it's on NPM or Bower. And many times the component is really only even usable in the context of their specific code base.
Yeah.
And so we, in the course of some work with Google, thought it would be interesting to try and articulate the degree to which a component should be flexible. And we decided that the standard for that was to look at the built-in HTML elements. And those, I think, people overlook how amazing it is that you can take pretty much any combination of the standard elements, put them together, nested inside of each other, and you can probably predict what the browser will do when it renders them, even though you may never have, thought about, well, what would it mean to put an image inside of an anchor tag, or even a button? Can I put a video inside of a button? Well, yeah, the browsers cope with that degree of flexibility quite well, and so we sort of wanted to build components that measure up to that same degree of flexibility, so that people can adapt it to a wide range of use cases.
And people think that the DOM is not very powerful. It's a shame. I hear it every once in a while, like, oh no, DOM bad. But the DOM is quite an amazing thing, really, when you think about how well it does work and how much performance is there now.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing. It's quite rich when you think of the phenomenal amount of work it's doing at each sort of layer of work, in painting and compositing and doing the layout. It's fairly impressive what it can do already, and all the browser vendors care deeply about making that better. So I think it's a great platform in general, and somewhat these days underappreciated. So people may look at the DOM as really nothing more than a set of rendering primitives, like as if they were just rendering rectangles on the screen. But it actually is pretty impressive in what it can do.
So, I mean, you mentioned the gold standard, and the gold standard's been around for a little while now. I'm not going to say forever because...
Yeah, it's about a year, I think.
Yeah, about a year. Do you find that web developers who are building components, because I like you, I see a lot of components that I would think would be an example, but are indeed a component that is very specific. Not generic enough for, I would say, general use in a lot of projects. Are developers following that gold standard today, or are people sort of ignoring it? Because the gold standard is really, really awesome, and I should stress that right now, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. The gold standard is pretty cool, and you should be following it. But are developers following it?
I think so. One is it's impossible for us to actually measure, in some objective way whether people are doing it. Although, from time to time we'll talk about this idea of, maybe at some point the web will have something like a certification lab. So, like if you pick up any electronic device and look underneath it, or on the back of it, there'll be like a UL sign from Underwriters Laboratory or a CE. There'll be these labs that sort of verify, like, hey, if you drop this in your bathtub, it's not going to blow up your house or something. They have some set of standards that the device has to measure up to, and we've talked about whether it'd be interesting to have a group that could do an audit over your component and give you like a seal that you can stick in your GitHub repo saying, like, yep, we measure up to the standard. We're not there yet. People, at this point, I think it's fairly aspirational, to be honest. People say, this is awesome. I think when people are designing components for their own use, which I expect going to be 90% of what they're doing. You've got like a team, maybe a shared design team, or a team that's building components for use by a larger app group. They can afford to cut some corners, so they don't have to make everything bulletproof. But as people try and attack this problem of building components for a general audience, then I think this will come into play. So as I said, I think at this point it's fairly aspirational. It turns out that I think there's about 64 items on the checklist right now. Some of them you can't even meet. Some criteria you can't meet because the browser doesn't give you enough primitives. And we think that's that ends up being feedback that we bring back to the browsers and say, hey, here's this thing that we want as a component. I want to be able to do something as robustly as a native element does, but I can't. So can you please, add hooks that let us do this? A good example might be handling resize. To do that in a robust way.
I imagine I think the gold standard would probably be really good to kind of base your decisions on what you're going to base your own library on, perhaps, because obviously when a development house or whatever is building their own components for their own use, like you said, like I might build a component which is like a login form component that I'm going to use many, many times throughout different projects and stuff for myself, but that's probably not something I'd want to stick the gold standard kind of badge on because it's not designed for other people to use it. But of course, something that you're going to start your projects off with would be really good to see that kind of seal of approval, that you're going to start off with something kind of up to the standard.
Yeah, and I hope that people will look at it as just a list of things that they may not have considered. For example, there's a checklist item around handling changes to your component after it's been instantiated that I think people overlook. We've seen lots of components where the component, when it's first created, sort of looks at its attributes, looks at its children, and then sets something up. And then that's kind of it. It's not able to cope with live changes to its attributes or contents at runtime. It won't sort of dynamically adjust, or if it does, requires you to sort of poke it by calling some method to get it to relay out its children or whatever it's supposed to do. And simply pointing out to people, hey, this is something you should think about in the design of your component. Whether or not they're going to be vending that component in a public marketplace, I still think it's a useful reference. Here's a list of things that you should think about. Maybe in the use case that you're tackling right now, being able to set up your component on instantiation is sufficient. But the next project is going to come along, and they're going to want to be able to call a pen child on your component, and stick a new thing in there, and your component should notice that and respond appropriately. And having someone know about that list of expectations up front, maybe that guides them to better architectural choices in creating the component.
So it gets a little bit into kind of best practices and stuff, and good things to look out for as well. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting to me that when you start to build components, you really do have to think about the API that your component exposes, correct? I mean, I think there is that sort of gap in certain cases where you see components that only do that initial setup. They don't listen over its lifetime for those changes, where you see that there's been a slight gap in the understanding that, oh, my API should be a little bit more than what it is probably now.
Yeah, I think that there's the gold standard's one way that we can sort of encourage people to think about by looking at the behavior of the native HTML elements, and for example, the fact that those respond to runtime changes. We can sort of encourage people to, as a best practice, do the same work in their own components. And then I also think we can improve sort of the overall level of quality of componentry by providing good examples. So having a really robust menu component that lets people see, like, oh yeah, here this menu component is tackling a wide range of issues like keyboard navigation and accessibility that maybe I would have forgotten about. So I think that there will be a number of ways in which we can provide resources to the industry at large that will encourage better design of components.
So speaking of resources and things, you've recently released version 0.7, which in the blog post is sort of a transition point into Mixins, which realistically you talked about a little bit in a blog post in December. Tell us a little bit about that strategy and how it's going to be worked into sort of the components that are being built now.
Sure. Yeah, we're quite excited by that. We just posted on Monday, the 1st of February. We talked about sort of a release that's built on a strategy that we've been sketching out in our blog over the past few months. We wanted to come up with an architecture that would be a happy medium between a component, like when people say I'm writing my component in vanilla JavaScript, I can expect maybe I'm going to look at their component and it's going to be 30 lines of source, and they've got a created callback and an attached callback and attribute change callback, and they're doing sort of the bare minimum to get that component to work. And there's a certain elegance to that you can look at it and see, and appreciate in one screenful maybe everything that the component's going to do, but at the cost that it's going to omit a lot of important cases. So it's just an example. If maybe I want to use that component under the shadow DOM and custom elements polyfills. Well, there's work you have to do to, for example, shim styles, CSS styles, to get it to work under the shadow DOM polyfill. And so, doing that work yourself actually turns out to be a little tricky, and you're better off using some kind of shared helper or a framework to take care of that for you. At the same time, we didn't want to go all to the way to the other extreme and have a really heavyweight framework for a number of reasons. In particular, I think that frameworks have their place, whether it's React or Polymer or whatever you want to do. We were trying to create something, by the nature of this project, we wanted small general-purpose components that could be used anywhere. And we felt like depending too much on a single framework, expecting them to include, a runtime, for example, was asking a lot. So we tried to come up with something that was a happy medium between vanilla JavaScript components that are very clean and simple, but don't maybe handle all the edge cases or aren't particularly sophisticated, and large frameworks where the framework's providing a lot of the value. And the strategy that we were trying to pursue was one of, as you said, Mixins. We thought that we were shy about trying to come up with some kind of class hierarchy and try and fit everything into traditional single inheritance class hierarchy. Mixins seemed to be an intriguing answer for us. And we were able to come up, thanks to some new changes in ES6, with a way of doing mixins that, rather than destructively modifying a class prototype, instead we implement our mixins as a function that takes a class and returns a new class, a subclass, that adds the desired features. And so mixin, depending on your definition of mixin, some people have a very specific traditional notion of a mixin. I don't know what you would call these things. They're like class extensions. So you take any class, maybe one you created or one that's native in HTML, and then you can extend it with these features. And so we decomposed we sort of factored all the work that our components did into about, right now it's about 25 mixins that cover things from things like accessibility, handling, the keyboard, pagination, a bunch of things. And so we're trying to develop each of those into their own sort of separate feature and deliver that as a mixin, so that someone, if they're building, say, a list-like component that has selection semantics, then they can easily add that to their list. Everyone who's building a list has written some code. They're like, okay, well, I've got a list. I need to keep track of the selected item. And I need a way of getting, I want to set that item via index or by handing an object reference. And, I guess I want select next and select previous, and maybe select first and select last for good measure. And, they end up recreating a whole API for managing selection. We can provide that to them through this mixin strategy, and they'll get a bunch of benefits. Like that selection semantics mixin that we've got happens to work very well with a mixin for exposing selection via ARIA, so that people with screen readers can navigate a list and have either a screen reader or voiceover sort of tell you what's going on without the developer having to really understand that technology.
With all the mixins, obviously, that kind of the more mixins you add or mixins you use in your components and stuff, it may add like a bit of baggage to each of those components that obviously when you then want to use in another project or something where you're not already including those, you kind of need to bring them along with you. Kind of, how are you planning on keeping that to a minimum, so there's like less friction for people to be able to use these things? Or
so the way that we currently have, there's a number of things going on. I think it's interesting that web components is happening right around the same time that some other trends are going on. So ES6 is one. The sort of continued evolution of package managers is another, and being able to sort of define code in modules. So I think there may be some very important synergy between those trends, such that it might not be possible to create a really vibrant web components ecosystem. Even if such a thing had existed 5 years ago, maybe the state of package managers then and ES5 would have been insufficient. In this particular case, what we can do is we provide the mixin in a npm package someone can include as a dependency. Then they can use an ES6 import statement to reference that mixin and mix it into their class. And if you're using then a build tool like Webpack or Browserify, it can then chase down that dependency on the mixin and include it into your source. So you can then create a component that you can hand to someone, and they don't have to understand that it included this bit of code that came from the basic web components project. All they know is that it exposes a selection API and supports the ARIA accessibility API. So
you think you'll be?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
So I think that it may be that these are a set of practices for distributing things that allow us to do that without someone having to keep track of, say, a long list of scripts. I mean, it used to be that if you were using, I don't know, you're using the moment ago, that moment.js to keep track of, to be able to render time in a friendly way. Well, if you're using that anywhere in a component, then don't forget you also have to include moment.js in your script somewhere. And I think that would have been unworkable. Here, the components can define their own dependencies and the build tool can take care of chasing those down.
Have you ever considered making those mixins available through other package managers like JSPM or something like that? Why particularly NPM? Is it because it's just the most popular one at the moment, or?
I think we started with Bower just because that was sort of the way to do web components originally, and when NPM 3 came out, we saw an opportunity to move to NPM just because it is it is much more popular, and it delivers a set of features that I think are pretty important. So, for example, if you're an enterprise, being able to maintain a private registry for your own enterprise and distribute those packages the same way, like that's pretty powerful. So we also saw that there's a having an entity behind the package manager that has a business model that we can understand is reassuring. So Bower is backed by a very nice group of very capable developers, as far as we can tell, as a hobby, which is okay so far as that goes. But I actually like the idea of depending on a package manager backed by a group of people that are trying to make money off of it. They're just going to have the business incentive they have to deliver, for example, to their enterprise customers is going to help ensure a degree of support, reliability, etc. that we want to take advantage of.
You briefly mentioned ES6 or ES 2015. I saw in a blog post that you've started writing your components using ES6 now. Kind of other than the few things you already mentioned, what are the main benefits of using ES6 as opposed to ES5? So
there's a couple. One is that it takes ES6 sort of tips the balance on a number of important points. One for us was we had previously been using HTML imports and having script and markup inside of a single HTML import. There was a certain attractiveness to be able to, there's this question, do you put your HTML inside of your JavaScript or your JavaScript inside of your HTML? HTML imports has the latter, you put the JavaScript inside the HTML. We were looking for a way of putting HTML inside of JavaScript easily. JSX is one answer to that. Sort of do it and then have a preprocessor that's going to sort of handle the markup that's embedded there. But a simple answer in ES6 was just having template strings, so you can have a backtick and then include multi-line markup. And it's very simple. It's not a huge syntactic change to the language, but it suddenly opens up this possibility that we can embed markup quite easily and quite legibly. So that was that's a small example. It also changes things like for example, Polymer has some helpers to wire up event handlers. They have this listener's key that lets you quickly wire up event handlers. And that was a response to the fact that wiring up, calling add event listener natively required a little bit of boilerplate, including handling binding to this to make sure that you got the correct lexical binding. And ES6 has the arrow operator, so you can have arrow functions that handle that. And that's just good enough that we felt like, okay, we can go back to using an add event listener in a native way. We don't need the listener's key in Polymer to be able to, we don't, or Xtag has the same thing. We don't need some helper to do that. It's just terse enough that we can wire these things up ourselves. And that sort of led to an idea to try and be as close to the metal as possible. We're really trying to use the language and the browser whenever possible, rather than layering stuff on top that people have to understand.
When I first started building web components, I did it in ES5, with templates, etc. But then moving over to ES 2015, I think just generally it just looks a lot cleaner. It seems simpler and easier to understand as you're developing them. So I think that's another good benefit as well.
Yeah, the other big thing that it brought us is it opened up some features that wouldn't have been possible. So the best example there is they finally have a convention for subclassing and calling, having a subclass call a base class implementation through this super keyword, which again it's a small feature, but it turns out to be the critical thing that unlocks our ability to provide mixins in the way we do. We have these class subclass factories, and they make heavy use of the super keyword in these mixins to make sure that the mixins behave well. And without, the super's not doing much. It's just, walking up the prototype chain to find something. But there was never a standard way to do that. And the fact that that's now a standard thing in the language with standard semantics means that we can build our mixins this way. So in that particular case, the language change made possible a completely new model for extending elements.
And it is nice, right? There is no one great correct way to build web components, right? There are many sort of approaches that allow a multitude of designs, and I think that makes the standard very powerful in everybody's mind, is that you're not stuck with the one way. It gives you some primitives that you can build on top of, be it with ES6 or ES 2015, and sort of what the DOM has and what these things like the custom elements API give us. And that's a powerful sort of thing that we did not have on the web for a long time.
Yeah, I was trading mail with a basic web components user last week. He was concerned about the fact that we were taking components that we'd previously written in Polymer and were writing them in native JavaScript. And he had expressed a concern. For example, he said, "Well, I really like data binding in Polymer, and I don't know what I'm going to do if you've changed your components. I won't be able to use your components anymore if you're not using data binding." And happily, I was able to point out, well, because web components are just a standard addition to the DOM API, there's a set of features like data binding that our components can support, even though we're not written using that feature ourselves. So it turns out, in the case of Polymer, their data binding model works with any component that takes attributes as input and generates events as notifications when the attributes change. And that's all you have to do is follow a particular convention. If you have a property called foo, you need to find a setter and getter for it, and then when that foo property changes, you need to remember to raise a custom event called foo-changed. And anything with that signature, they can bind to. So we can, under the covers, in our components, we don't have to use that data binding model. We don't, as it turns out, we don't use data binding at all. We just wire up the components in code. But we could use something completely different. And then, as long as we're exposing attributes and events this way, standard DOM attributes and events, then another consumer like Polymer can bind to them, and it works great. So we, as a proof of concept, we made a little interop demo showing a Polymer, one of their paper tabs elements binding to our basic carousel element, and it works great. It's so if you want to use data binding in Polymer, that's something you can do because of that standard. So you don't have to change your model for interacting with something based on how the author wrote the component. As you can just think about it as part of the standard.
Yeah, interoperability, I think, is the thing that sort of sometimes doesn't get enough story when we talk about web components, because opinions and, I built it this way and here's my example and yada 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 take over, and people forget that there is a huge interop story that makes web components really powerful, that if you're using framework XYZ, it doesn't matter. You can still use web components in your particular project. You don't have to piecemeal destroy everything you've written lately just to use this one component. Bring it in, test it out. You might like it.
Yeah, I think that's really the critical thing for us. I mean, that's why we, several years ago got so excited about web components, was because there's this idea of network effects that you're going to get, if you've got several, millions of people using something, it's going to be better than if only 1,000 people are using it. And it's not just going to be 1,000 times better; it'll be many orders of magnitude better. And so, you could look at any ecosystem, whether it's jQuery or Ember or Backbone. Anything that's designed for just one of those frameworks is just the way it works is going to have a sort of a relatively small community of people using it. And in our case, that means that it may not be then worth it to lavish all this design and usability attention on these building blocks. But if we've got millions of people using them, then suddenly the equation changes, and it makes that possible. So we can make sure that we have, as near perfect a menu as is possible to create in the web, and everyone can benefit from that. They don't have to build it. They don't build their app the way that we built it, but they can take advantage of that network effect.
I think interop can go even further than that, really, because imagine building a particular component now that you can just keep using for years across all the different technologies. I mean, the technology stack changes so much nowadays. Obviously, you've got the big frameworks like Angular and React, and you don't really know what's coming next. Yeah. And of course, if you look at the AngularJS developers, obviously I'm a massive fan of AngularJS, but obviously, so you build your directives and those kind of things, which are really interoperable in that kind of ecosystem. But you can't just take a directive and then go and use it in React or a future framework where with web components being more of a standard, you could do that. You could build a web component to use in AngularJS now, but then if the stack changes later on, you can take that and reuse it, and you've not lost anything at all, which I think is really an attractive thing of web components.
Yeah, it's sort of a way of encapsulating, here's how I thought about doing this back in 2016, and when me in 2019 is having to support that. If that thing was a web component, then at least it's got a certain degree of interoperability. Whereas if it's a piece of Angular 2 code that I wrote in 2016 or React code, the chances are that thing is still relevant in 2019 is pretty low. And I'm pretty excited. I think that the day will come where if you're trying out the latest mobile hotness, some app, whether it's that someone will create something cool, an effect or a user interaction, the next pull to refresh, for example, some little trick, and you'll see it and you'll go, wow, I want to use that in my app. And by the time you've discovered that and noticed that UI trick, someone will have created a great implementation of that idea as a web component, and you'll be able to drop it in, and it won't be you won't have to think about, wow, should I add this to my app? Is it worth the dev cost to me to go build that and reverse engineer it and go build it myself? And instead you'll say, well, I can try it out, and if it works, then now it's part of my app.
Cool.
So, Raphael, speaking of interop and wonderful things, you're working on version 1.1 of Masonic. So before we get into the interop thing, how is 1.1 coming along?
It's coming along nicely. I'm quite excited by this future release because I think I've addressed a lot of pain people could have with Bosonic. First, of course, there are a few new elements, but more importantly, I try to to have a default style on all elements. I wanted the elements to look nice because one of the critiques I heard was that the demos were ugly, and I must say it was a bit intentional because I wanted my elements to stay to have a really basic style so that they could be easily themable. The problem is a lot of people want to just pick and drop elements into their project, so they need a good default style. So I think that's an important thing. I also added a lot of good transitions, so to have a bit of wow effect. And I added good support for gestures like tap, pan, and swipe. It was important because in my everyday job, I build
I'd like to ask a few questions on styling, if possible. You mentioned that originally you kept your components quite simple because of people want to obviously style them to meet their application requirements and things. So how would a typical user be able to style your different components? Because if you use the shadow DOM, obviously it's quite difficult to pierce the styling from a higher level. You used to be able to use like /deep and things in CSS, but that's recently been deprecated. Have you come across any problems like that with people trying to style over your components, and kind of what solutions have you come up with? I suppose similar question to Jan as well, if you'd like to answer as well.
Yeah. I use the same approach than Polymer, that is using CSS properties. So my elements expose a lot of properties. The only difference is I didn't want to include a huge polyfile to polyfill CSS properties. So for now, there is a sort of build tool that you can use to build your own themed elements.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, the fact is, I think in a few months, all the major browsers will support custom properties, so CSS properties. So you definitely will be able to use that without a build step.
Yeah,
Right.
so, yeah, we've Raphael and I have traded mail on this a couple times. That we view the lack of a really elegant CSS styling solution today to be an issue. Firefox, Chrome, and now WebKit all have implementations of CSS variables coming. They're either out, or in WebKit's case, I think it's Safari 9.1 they've announced will support that. So that's pretty exciting. That'll also be on iOS Safari. But that leaves Microsoft's browsers. So even if you're willing to write off the deprecated versions of IE, you still got IE 11 and then Microsoft Edge, and they don't have any support there. So we've Raphael and I are looking for sort of a good solution for that. That problem, it may be a combination of build time steps people can do to pre-process things, and then a way of somehow handling that to a component, and then also polyfills, maybe something along the lines of Polymer has they have this style tag, style is equals custom style, that'll do their particular brand of polyfilling. So I think trying to come up with an answer that we can agree upon will be beneficial, because right now anyone trying to target IE and Edge will have to invent some workaround of their own. So at least if we can have a set of, a relatively small set of workarounds, hopefully some of those will be supported well enough by the community that they can get some critical mass during this period. I think in a year or so this problem goes away as IE11 usage falls off and Edge finally delivers CSS variables. But for the foreseeable future, that remains kind of a sticking point for web components.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about this interop story, and it intrigues me, because you do have there's a ticket that you have for the 1.1 milestone, Raphael, about sort of that talks about Mixins, and sort of you guys have this sort of collaboration that's sort of started, it's sort of an exploratory phase of like, how do you see like what does a common Mixin look like cross-project? What are some of the sort of pitfalls or pratfalls that have sort of happened as that conversation has occurred? Because I got to imagine that it's not, today it's all Mixins work across all the things.
Yeah. Well, it's a as you say, both of us are interested in a lot of the same things. Both Raphael with Bosonic and us with Basic Web Components. We have similar ideals and similar goals. So I think there's at least the possibility for unifying our efforts. And that can take a lot of forms. So we're just beginning sort of to explore how that would work. I think in a lot of cases, there have been. It's easy for two projects to say, hey, we're both solving the same problem. Let's work together. And there's a range of issues that can come up. Everything, there could be technological issues. There could be sort of social and political issues. There could be economic issues that make that hard. I'm fairly positive that we'll be able to work through that and come up with a solution that not only works for our two projects, but will be made stronger in that collaboration, such that other people will join in. One of the things that I think we've been missing is a robust, elegant, open way of creating web components using a sort of taking a minimal approach to the framework. So either having no framework at all in the form of, there's no common runtime, there's just sort of mix-ins where you're paying for the features as you go, or some minimal runtime, and a set of common behaviors that could be incorporated as mix-ins or with auxiliary components that do part of a job that can all be combined together to create a component. There hasn't really been a sort of a critical mass behind a strategy like that, and so I'm hoping that we can sort of put that together. As I said earlier, we don't really have big egos, so if someone else were out there building that today, we would probably be using it. But since we haven't seen anything like that meets our needs, we're trying to help bring that about ourselves.
And I think that's amazing. I really do. It can be very difficult to sometimes collaborate on something so on something that's going to have such a very large impact on the web community as a whole. And I commend you both for going down what is no. I can't imagine it's a particularly easy thing to deal with. I'm sure coworkers and I have thrown pencils at each other over less things.
Yeah, I can. It's difficult. It's rare often in the JavaScript community in general to see such great collaboration where people often get in competition with each other and things over these kind of stuff. So it's really great to see that.
Yeah, I think that there's in the greater world of business, there's always economic competition that's driving things. I think in the open source world, a lot of it comes down to ego. A lot of people that are involved in projects, it's important to them that their project be the one that they gave birth to, they named, they started, and they remain. They're getting both credit in the market for it, and they can remain, as some people have called it, the benevolent dictator. The person who's running the project and everyone's looking to. Like everyone, in the open source community seems to be at least wants to be in that position where people are coming to them and say, "Hey, can you please add this to the project?" And they're deciding whether it should happen or not. And so I think that that holds back a lot of collaboration.
Yeah, you've got to give and take as well, definitely.
Yeah.
So we're just about up against time in this episode. If people want to contribute to your projects, if people want to get in touch with you all, how do they go about doing that?
So for Component Kitchen, us as an entity, probably the simplest way is on Twitter. We're at ComponentK, and that's probably the best way to reach us. Our Basic Web Components project, you guys will have a link to that. That's sort of a great place to start in reading about the work we're doing.
And for me, of course, Twitter too. It's a Bosonic_project, and of course on GitHub.
If anybody wants to get in touch and talk about writing full applications and stuff using web components, then I'm at RevelWeb on Twitter, and it'd be great to hear from people, definitely.
Well, let me thank our panel and our guests, Leon, Jan, and Raphael, for being on this episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Thank you all so much for coming on.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was great.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And this has been another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. I am Justin Ribeiro, signing off. See you next week.